might be wondering, do I need to taper nitrogen to get effective ripening and quality from our harvests? The answer is it really depends on the genetics of the cultivar. There was some research in 2025 that looked at this and used different nitrogen tapering methods on different cultivars to see what the effects were. And what they found out is that a significant part of the outcomes are dependent on the initial genetics. So certain strains showed no major differences in cannabinoids, terpenes, or yield with tapering nitrogen, while other strains did show significant differences. And so it shows that you can have a perfect nitrogen taper, and in some genetics, it won't matter at all. So half of this outcome is really decided by the strains you have. And that's why we're always telling people that there's no one-size-fits-all approach. You have to try different things, record the data, and see what actually works for the strains that you're running. The plant has two basic currencies. It has its carbon, which is produced from photosynthesis, and it has nitrogen, which is coming from the root zone, from the fertilizer. So under normal conditions, the plant is combining that stored carbon with nitrogen into amino acids and proteins and chlorophyll, and that's creating growth compounds. But under conditions where nitrogen is restricted, but the lights are still on, the plant's still photosynthesizing, but it doesn't have as much nitrogen to produce those growth compounds. So that carbon still has to go somewhere. If the plant can't spend it on growth, then it gets routed into molecules that don't need nitrogen. So cannabinoids, terpenes, flavonoids. And this isn't a stress response. This is like a metabolic pivot that happens naturally and is built into many different plant species. The higher the available carbon, the stronger the redirect is into these secondary metabolites. So the plant is always capturing carbon from light. Nitrogen decides what it builds with it. And then if you restrict that nitrogen, the carbon becomes cannabinoids. Another key factor in producing enough carbon is light. And one of the things that newer research has looked into is if having excess levels of nitrogen can be compensated by excess levels of light to take advantage of it, which the answer is not really. It doesn't actually help. In one of the studies, they manipulated the amount of nitrogen that was available to the strains to see if providing more would increase yield. And what they found is that providing more does increase yield up to a certain point. And then after that point, it may increase leaf mass continuously, but the end flower mass doesn't go up. So there's this point of severely diminishing returns where more nitrogen results in more leaves, but not more flower biomass. Now, is nitrogen tapering the same as flushing? It's not. And these are words that refer to sort of related concepts, but things that are distinctly different. When we talk about flushing, we're usually talking about using a low EC or no EC solution to run a lot of water through the root zone to flush out any stored ions or minerals that are in there. And this is not actually effective when it comes to nitrogen tapering because a lot of the nitrogen is actually stored in the plant tissues themselves. So if you just flush at the very end of flower, you can drain out the root zone, but you're not actually nitrogen tapering effectively. You need to start earlier than that, and you need to adjust the nutrients in a way where you're still providing enough total EC for the plant to photosynthesize and store carbon optimally, but limit nitrogen in the tissues bit by bit as flowering continues on. So I think it's really important to distinguish between these two strategies and not think that you can flush for the last 3 to 7 days of flower with a really low EC or water solution and get the same effects of nitrogen tapering. If you're going to flush by running a really low EC solution through the root zone to try to flush out the minerals there, that's not going to have the effect that you're looking for. The last part that I wanted to add an update to is that for those cultivars that do respond favorably to nitrogen manipulation, the timing is important. It appears that if you start a little bit earlier with that nitrogen flushing versus at the very end of the cycle, you can get better results for those cultivars because they have a significant amount of stored nitrogen in the plant. So starting earlier with the nitrogen tapering lets the plant use up some of that stored nitrogen so that then it can shift that carbon to nitrogen ratio. So the question you might be asking is, if I don't taper nitrogen, could that interfere with the ripening and the quality of the finished flower? And the answer is it depends, or sometimes. What the research found was that the genetics explain about 50% of the variation in response to nitrogen. So effectively what that means for the grower is that some strains are going to produce adequate quality, ripening, terpene, and cannabinoids under conditions of high nitrogen. And that's just something to do with the genetics, where other ones are certainly going to require lowered nitrogen levels in order to ripen fully and to generate all of the quality characteristics that we care about.